There's a voice in your head that has been narrating your entire life, and most people have never once stopped to ask, is it even telling the truth? Before we start, tell me in the comments, what's the first thing that voice says to you when you make a mistake? Carl Jung spent his life studying that voice, and what he discovered will completely change the way you talk to yourself. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you will know exactly how to turn that voice from your worst enemy into your greatest ally. Right now, in this exact moment, there is a conversation happening inside you. You didn't choose to start it. Nobody asked your permission. It began the moment you were old enough to understand language, and it has not stopped since. Every single day, thousands of times a day, you talk to yourself. You comment on what you do. You judge how you look. You predict how things will go before they even happen. You replay conversations from years ago and rewrite them in your head, giving yourself the perfect comeback you never said out loud. This inner dialogue is so constant, so automatic, that most people mistake it for reality itself. They don't experience it as a voice. They experience it as the truth. But Carl Jung, one of the most important psychologists who ever lived, spent decades studying the human mind and came to a conclusion that most people still don't understand today. The voice in your head is not you. It is not the truth. It is a construction built from your childhood, your wounds, your culture, your fears, and the countless moments when someone else's opinion of you became your opinion of yourself. And here is the part that changes everything. If that voice was built, it can be rebuilt. If it was learned, it can be relearned. Jung didn't just study this idea from a distance. He lived it. He spent years in deliberate conversation with the deeper layers of his own mind. And what he found down there reshaped the entire field of psychology. So today we are not going to give you shallow affirmations or empty positivity. We are going to walk through what Jung actually discovered about the structure of the human psyche, and more importantly, how you can use that structure to change the way you speak to yourself, starting today. Let's begin with something most people never consider. You assume there is one you doing all this talking, one single unified self sitting behind your eyes, narrating your life like a movie. Jung disagreed. He believed the psyche is not one voice, but many. Inside every human being, there are multiple centers of personality, multiple sub-personalities, each with its own perspective, its own memories, its own agenda. Some psychologists before Jung treated this idea as a symptom of illness. Jung treated it as the normal architecture of the human mind. You are not one voice, you are a council, and most people never learn to run that council. Instead, one voice, usually the loudest and harshest one, takes over the microphone and never lets go. Think about your own inner dialogue for a moment. When you fail at something, is the voice that responds calm and understanding? Or is it sharp, mocking, impatient, the way an exhausted, disappointed parent might sound? For most people, it's the second one, and that is not an accident. That voice was not born the day you were born. It was built, piece by piece, out of every criticism you absorbed, every comparison you were subjected to, every time you were told you weren't enough, weren't fast enough, weren't smart enough, weren't good enough. Jung would say, that voice is not your authentic self speaking. It is a fragment, a complex, a piece of your psyche that split off and hardened into its own semi-independent structure. And once you understand that, you can stop treating it as the final word on who you are. This is the first and most important shift you need to make. Stop assuming the voice in your head is the truth. Start asking where it came from, because once you trace a thought back to its origin, you take away its authority. A criticism that feels like an eternal truth about your worth suddenly looks very different when you realize it's just an old recording, playing on a loop, installed by circumstances that have nothing to do with who you actually are today. Now, to understand how to change the way you talk to yourself, we need to understand one of Jung's most famous ideas, the persona. The persona is the mask you wear for the world. It's the version of you that shows up at work, at family gatherings, on social media, in every social situation where you are, consciously or not, managing how others perceive you. The persona isn't fake exactly. It's a necessary tool. You need some kind of social mask to function in a complex world. The problem starts when you forget it's a mask. When you begin to believe the persona is the whole of who you are, you start talking to yourself the way an audience would judge a performer. You start narrating your inner life as if it were a performance being watched and graded, even when no one else is in the room. This is why so many people feel exhausted by their own minds. They are not just living. They are constantly performing an internal review of their own performance. Did I say the right thing? Did I look foolish? Am I behind where I should be? Is everyone else doing better than me? This isn't self-awareness. It's self-surveillance, and it comes directly from a persona that has grown too large, swallowing the rest of the personality whole. Jung believed that real growth begins when you start to separate from the persona, when you recognize, this is a role I play, not the entirety of who I am. And when you talk to yourself, you have a choice. You can talk to yourself as the exhausted performer worried about the audience's reaction. Or you can talk to yourself as the person behind the mask, the one who doesn't need the performance to feel whole. That second voice is quieter at first. It has been buried under years of persona management, but it's there. And learning to speak from that place, rather than from the mask, is one of the most powerful shifts you can make. Now let's go deeper into the part of Jung's work that most people find uncomfortable but absolutely necessary: the shadow. The shadow is everything about yourself that you have rejected, hidden, or refused to look at. It contains the traits you were taught were unacceptable: your anger, your jealousy, your selfishness, your desire for power, for attention, for rest, for pleasure, without guilt attached. Every quality that got you punished, shamed, or rejected as a child gets pushed down into the shadow, where it doesn't disappear. It just goes underground and continues to influence you from the dark. Here is the connection to your inner voice. That harsh, critical, punishing tone you use on yourself did not come from nowhere. Very often it is your shadow speaking, using the same cruel language that was once used against you. You learned somewhere along the way that certain parts of you were dangerous, embarrassing, or unlovable, and instead of simply feeling that pain once and moving on, you internalized a permanent guard, a voice whose entire job is to police those parts of you and make sure they never surface again. That guard talks to you constantly. It's the voice that says, "Don't even try, you'll just embarrass yourself." It's the voice that says, "Who do you think you are?" It's the voice that turns every mistake into proof of a permanent, fundamental flaw rather than a normal, forgivable moment of being human. The instinct most people have is to fight this voice, to argue with it, to try to silence it through sheer willpower or forced positivity. Jung would tell you this almost never works, and here is why. What you resist persists. When you fight the shadow directly, you give it more energy, not less. The shadow doesn't want to be silenced. It wants to be seen, acknowledged, and eventually integrated. Jung's radical idea was this: instead of suppressing the parts of yourself you don't like, you have a conversation with them. You bring them into the light, not to indulge them without limits, but to understand what they are actually protecting you from and what they actually need. So how do you talk to your shadow instead of being run by it? It starts with a simple but uncomfortable practice. The next time that harsh inner voice appears, the one that criticizes, mocks, or shuts you down, don't just accept it as fact, and don't just try to silence it. Pause and ask it a question. Ask, what are you afraid will happen if I don't listen to you? This sounds strange the first time you try it, but stay with it. Often underneath the harsh critic, there is a much younger, much more frightened part of you. One that learned a long time ago that failure led to punishment, that mistakes led to rejection, that being seen clearly led to being hurt. The critic isn't cruel because it hates you. It is cruel because it is trying, in a clumsy, outdated way, to protect you from experiencing that pain again. When you understand this, your relationship to your own harsh self-talk begins to change. You stop hearing, "I am worthless," as a fact about reality. You start hearing it as a frightened, protective part of you, still using the only strategy it ever learned: harsh criticism as a shield against failure. And once you see it that way, you can respond differently. Not with self-hatred toward the critic, but with a kind of firm compassion. You can say internally something like, "I hear you. I understand you're trying to protect me. But this way of protecting me is actually hurting me more than the thing you're afraid of. Let me try it a different way this time. This is not weakness. This is not letting yourself off the hook. This is precisely what Jung called integration. Not eliminating the difficult parts of yourself, but bringing them into a working relationship with the rest of your personality, so they stop running the show from the shadows and start working with you instead of against you." Let's talk now about one of Jung's most practical tools, something you can actually use today, called active imagination. Jung developed this technique after a period of intense personal crisis, when he found himself flooded with strange images, symbols, and inner voices that he didn't fully understand. Instead of pushing them away, he decided to engage with them directly, treating the different aspects of his psyche as if they were real characters he could have a genuine conversation with. He would sit quietly, let an image or a feeling arise, and then, in his imagination, ask it questions. What are you? What do you want? What do you know that I don't? You can do a simplified version of this yourself, and it will directly change how you talk to yourself. The next time you notice a strong emotional reaction, anger, anxiety, sadness, shame, instead of immediately trying to fix it, suppress it, or distract yourself from it, try sitting with it for just a few minutes. Picture that feeling as if it had a voice, or even a form. Ask it, silently or even out loud if you're alone, "What are you trying to tell me?" Then wait. Don't force an answer. Let whatever comes up, come up, without judging it immediately. You might be surprised by what surfaces. Often underneath anger, there is hurt. Underneath anxiety, there is a need for safety that isn't being met. Underneath shame, there is often an old belief that you are fundamentally flawed, a belief that was installed by someone else's words, long before you had the ability to question it. This practice changes your internal dialogue because it shifts you from being a passive victim of your emotions and thoughts to becoming an active participant in a relationship with your own mind. Instead of your inner voice simply happening to you, you begin to engage with it, question it, and eventually guide it. This is the foundation of everything else we're going to talk about today. Now let's talk about individuation, which was, in many ways, the central concept of Jung's entire life's work. Individuation is the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who you were told to be, who you were shaped into being by fear, or who you pretend to be through your persona. It is the process of integrating all the different parts of yourself, the persona, the shadow, the unconscious material that surfaces in dreams and strong emotions, into a coherent, whole personality. Jung believed this process never truly finishes. It's not a destination you arrive at and then relax. It's an ongoing conversation you have with yourself for the rest of your life. Here is why this matters so much for how you talk to yourself. If you believe you already know exactly who you are, fixed and finished, then any inner voice that contradicts that fixed image feels like a threat, something to be silenced immediately. But if you understand that you are always in process, always becoming, then that same voice becomes something else entirely, information. A part of you trying to get your attention, a signal that some aspect of your personality is asking to be acknowledged, understood, or expressed. This reframes the entire nature of your inner dialogue. Negative self-talk stops being a verdict on your worth and starts being data about which parts of your psyche are asking for attention. Anxiety about the future isn't proof that you're broken. It might be an unmet need for preparation or safety. Anger at a friend isn't proof that you're a bad person. It might be an unexpressed boundary that has been ignored for too long. When you start listening to your inner voice this way, as information rather than final judgment, everything changes. You stop arguing with yourself and start collaborating with yourself. Let's bring in another one of Jung's core ideas, archetypes. Jung believed that beneath our individual personal experiences, there exists a deeper layer of the mind, shared across all of humanity, which he called the collective unconscious. Within this layer lie archetypes, universal patterns, and images that show up again and again across cultures, myths, religions, and dreams throughout human history. Things like the hero, the wise old man or woman, the great mother, the trickster, and the child. These archetypes are not just abstract academic concepts. They show up inside your own self-talk all the time, often without you realizing it. When you're facing a difficult challenge and something inside you says, "You can push through this, you've survived worse," that's the hero archetype speaking, the part of you oriented toward courage, struggle, and growth. When you're able to step back from a problem and think clearly, calmly, with perspective beyond your immediate panic, that's closer to the wise old man or wise woman archetype, the part of you connected to deeper wisdom and patience. When you feel playful, curious, willing to try something new without worrying about the outcome, that's the child archetype, the part of you still capable of wonder. And when the voice in your head is cruel, punishing, impossible to please, that is very often what Jung would associate with a corrupted or wounded parental archetype, an internalized authority figure who never learned to balance discipline with warmth. The exciting thing here is this: because these archetypal patterns exist within all of us, you are never limited to just one of them. You are not doomed to only hear the cruel inner parent. The wise old man is in there too. The hero is in there too. The playful child is in there too. Part of learning to talk to yourself differently is learning to deliberately call on these other voices, rather than letting the loudest, harshest one dominate the entire conversation by default. Here is a practical way to use this. The next time you're struggling with something and your inner critic takes over, try consciously shifting perspective. Ask yourself, what would the wisest version of me say right now? Not the harshest version, the wisest one. Picture, even just for a moment, an inner figure who represents patience, deep understanding, and long experience. What would that figure say to you in this exact situation? You are not making things up out of nothing when you do this. You are calling on a pattern that Jung believed already exists within the structure of your own psyche, one that has simply been underused compared to the harsher voices you learned to rely on by default. There's one more piece of Jung's model that deeply affects how people talk to themselves, and it's often overlooked: the anima and animus. Jung believed that within every person exists an inner figure of the opposite psychological polarity. In men, an inner feminine aspect he called the anima, and in women, an inner masculine aspect he called the animus. Beyond the gendered language Jung used, which reflected the era he lived in, the deeper idea is this: within each of us exists both a more nurturing, receptive, emotionally attuned mode of being, and a more assertive, structured, action-oriented mode of being. Most people develop one side more than the other, largely because of cultural conditioning about how they were expected to behave. When your self-talk is completely one-sided, either endlessly harsh, driving and demanding with no warmth at all, or endlessly passive, self-doubting, and unable to take decisive action, that imbalance often reflects an underdeveloped relationship with one of these inner modes. The goal isn't to eliminate the driving, structured voice in favor of only softness, or to eliminate the nurturing voice in favor of only discipline. The goal is integration, learning to talk to yourself with both firmness and warmth, both structure and compassion, depending on what the moment actually calls for. Think about how a genuinely great mentor speaks to someone they care about. They don't only offer comfort, because comfort alone doesn't build competence. And they don't only offer discipline, because discipline alone without warmth creates shame, not growth. A great mentor knows when to push and when to hold space. That is exactly the internal relationship Jung believed we should be cultivating with ourselves. Not a single voice, but a balanced internal counsel, capable of both challenge and care, deployed wisely depending on the situation. There's one more archetype worth naming here, one that shows up in almost every mythology on Earth in some form, from the coyote of indigenous American stories to the trickster gods of West African and Norse traditions: the trickster. In your own inner life, the trickster is the voice of resistance, procrastination, self-sabotage, the part of you that seems to deliberately undermine your own goals right when things start to matter most. Most people treat this voice purely as an enemy, something to be disciplined into submission through sheer willpower. Jung would encourage a slightly different question. What is the trickster actually disrupting, and why? Often self-sabotage isn't random. It shows up right before a real risk, a real exposure, a real chance of being seen and possibly judged. The trickster, in its own chaotic way, is sometimes protecting you from a vulnerability you haven't consciously acknowledged yet, or rebelling against a goal that was never truly yours to begin with, one you inherited from someone else's expectations rather than your own genuine desire. This is worth sitting with because it reflects something Jung noticed again and again across his decades of clinical work. The patterns showing up in one person's private inner dialogue are rarely as unique or as isolated as they feel from the inside. The same basic cast of characters, the harsh inner critic, the frightened inner child, the wise elder, the driven hero, the disruptive trickster, appears across cultures, centuries, and continents in myths written long before modern psychology existed as a field at all. Jung considered this one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the collective unconscious. The idea that beneath our personal, individual experiences lies a shared psychological inheritance common to the entire human species, which means that when you feel like your inner critic is uniquely brutal, uniquely convincing, uniquely impossible to escape, you are in a strange way in very good company. Humans have been wrestling with exactly this internal cast of characters for as long as we have been telling stories about ourselves. So let's make all of this concrete. Let's talk about exactly how to put this into practice, starting today, using a Jungian approach to your own inner dialogue. The first step is what we already touched on. Notice, without judgment, what your inner voice is actually saying. Most people never do this. They are so fused with their inner dialogue that they can't observe it from any distance at all. Start treating your thoughts the way Jung treated dream images and unconscious material, as things to be observed and questioned, not immediately obeyed. When a thought like, "I always mess everything up," arises, don't just believe it or fight it, notice it. Literally, in your mind, say, "There's that thought again." This tiny act of observation creates a small but crucial gap between you and the thought, and in that gap, choice becomes possible. The second step is tracing the voice back to its origin. Ask yourself, honestly, whose voice does this sound like? Is this really my own considered judgment, formed from clear thinking about the present situation? Or does this sound like an old teacher, a critical parent, a bully from years ago, a culture that told me my worth depended on constant achievement? You are not trying to blame anyone in this step. You are simply trying to see the thought clearly as something that was built by specific circumstances, rather than as an eternal, objective truth about who you are. The third step is dialogue, not suppression. Once you notice the voice and trace where it likely came from, engage with it the way Jung engaged with the unconscious material that arose in his own active imagination. Ask it what it's afraid of. Ask it what it thinks it's protecting you from. You might literally write this out, in a journal, as a kind of conversation. Write down the harsh thought, then write a response to it, not from a place of self-hatred, and not from a place of forced, hollow positivity either, but from a place of grounded honesty. If the voice says, "You're going to fail and everyone will see," you might respond with something like, "It's possible this doesn't go perfectly, and if it doesn't, that will be uncomfortable, but it won't be the end of anything. I have handled discomfort before. I can handle it again." The fourth step is deliberately calling on other archetypal voices, the ones you may have neglected. When the harsh inner parent shows up, ask what the wise mentor inside you would say instead. When the frightened inner child shows up, paralyzed by fear of failure, ask what a courageous, playful, adventurous part of you would say instead, the part that's curious rather than terrified about what happens next. You are not pretending to be someone you're not when you do this. You are giving airtime to parts of your own psyche that Jung would say are just as real and just as much you as the harsh, familiar critic that has dominated the conversation for years, simply because it learned to speak the loudest a long time ago. The fifth step, and this one is essential, is consistency over time. Jung didn't believe individuation happened overnight, and neither will this. The voice in your head that currently runs on autopilot has had years, sometimes decades, to build its habits, its default patterns, its well-worn neural pathways. You will not out-argue years of conditioning with a single afternoon of positive thinking. But every single time you pause, notice the voice, trace its origin, engage with it honestly, and consciously choose a different response, you are literally reshaping the pathways your mind defaults to. This is not mystical. This is simply how habits, including mental and emotional habits, are formed and reformed. Repetition builds default patterns, and you have the ability, starting today, to begin building new ones on purpose, rather than leaving that process entirely to chance and childhood circumstance. There's something important to understand here, something Jung himself would likely emphasize. This is not about achieving a state where your inner voice is always calm, always positive, always kind. That's not realism, and chasing it will only set you up for a new kind of self-judgment when you inevitably fall short of it. The goal is not a perfectly silent, perfectly pleasant mind. The goal is a mind in relationship with itself. A mind where the different voices, the critic, the protector, the wise elder, the frightened child, the driven hero, are known to you, understood by you, and most importantly, no longer running the show without your awareness. Because that is really the core of everything Jung taught about the psyche. The danger was never that you contain multiple voices, multiple parts, multiple archetypal patterns. The danger is when those parts operate unconsciously, hidden from your awareness, controlling your behavior, your self-worth, and your decisions from the shadows, without you ever questioning where they came from or whether they're actually serving you. The entire goal of the work Jung dedicated his life to was to bring the unconscious into consciousness, piece by piece, so that instead of being lived by unseen forces inside your own mind, you become an active, aware participant in your own psychological life. So here's what this actually looks like in your day-to-day existence. It looks like catching yourself mid-spiral, the moment that familiar, harsh voice starts its usual script, and instead of disappearing into it completely, creating just enough space to ask, whose voice is this, and is it actually serving me right now? It looks like treating your own strong emotions not as inconvenient malfunctions to be suppressed, but as messages worth decoding. It looks like consciously reaching for the wiser, calmer, more courageous parts of yourself that already exist inside you, rather than assuming the loudest, harshest voice is the only one available. And it looks like understanding that this is a practice, not a one-time fix, something you return to again and again, the same way Jung returned to his own inner dialogue for the rest of his life. Let's slow down for a moment and talk about something Jung called complexes, because this idea explains why certain thoughts and reactions feel so much bigger than the situation actually calls for. A complex, in Jung's language, is a cluster of emotionally charged memories, beliefs, and images, organized around a single theme that sits in your unconscious and activates automatically whenever something touches it. You've felt this before. Someone makes an offhand comment about your work, something small, something they probably forgot 5 minutes later, and yet you feel it in your chest for the rest of the day. That reaction is disproportionate to the actual event, and that disproportion is the signature of a complex being triggered. Complexes form early, usually in childhood, around moments of real emotional intensity. Humiliation in front of classmates, a parent's disappointment, a sibling who was always compared favorably, a moment where you felt powerless and small. The mind doesn't file these experiences away as isolated, closed events. It builds a structure around them, a kind of emotional alarm system, so that anything resembling that original wound in the future sets off the same old alarm at full volume, regardless of whether the present situation actually deserves that intensity. This is why an adult who is entirely competent at their job can still feel like a terrified, worthless child the moment their manager raises an eyebrow at their work. The manager isn't the threat. The old complex is reacting as if the original wound is happening all over again. Here's why this matters for your self-talk specifically. When a complex gets triggered, the voice that speaks in that moment is not your calm, considered, adult reasoning. It is the voice of the complex itself, often frozen at the emotional age it formed at. This is why, in moments of criticism or failure, your inner dialogue can suddenly sound so young, so absolute, so dramatic. Everyone thinks I'm useless. I always ruin everything. I'll never be good enough. These aren't measured adult conclusions. They are the voice of an old wound, speaking as if no time has passed at all. Once you recognize this, you gain an enormous amount of power over your own reactions. The next time you notice an emotional response that feels far too big for the situation in front of you, you can pause and ask, how old does this feeling feel? You might be surprised by the honest answer. Sometimes it feels like a scared 8-year-old. Sometimes it feels like a humiliated teenager. When you can name that, you can respond to it appropriately, the way a calm, grounded adult would respond to a frightened child, rather than treating the complex's exaggerated verdict as an accurate report on your actual worth as a grown person navigating a single moment in an ordinary day. Now let's bring in dreams, because Jung considered them one of the most direct lines of communication between your conscious mind and everything operating beneath it. Jung didn't see dreams as random noise produced by a resting brain. He saw them as messages, symbolic, sometimes strange, sometimes uncomfortable but meaningful, offering compensation for whatever your conscious attitude was missing or ignoring. If you've been suppressing anger all week, you might dream of a storm or a fight, or a fire refusing to be put out. If you've been neglecting a part of yourself that needs rest, you might dream of being lost, exhausted, unable to find your way home. You don't need to become a professional dream interpreter to use this idea practically. The simple habit of writing down your dreams, even fragments, even single images, and asking, what part of my current life might this be responding to, starts to build the same kind of internal dialogue we've been describing throughout this video. It treats your unconscious mind as a source of information rather than as random background static to be ignored the moment your alarm goes off. Over time, this habit sharpens your ability to notice patterns, not just in your dreams, but in your waking self-talk as well, because you start approaching your own mind with genuine curiosity instead of blind acceptance or knee-jerk dismissal. Let's walk through what this actually looks like for a real person, so the whole approach feels less abstract. Picture someone who has just been passed over for a promotion at work. The instant, automatic inner voice says, "Of course they didn't pick you. You're not cut out for this. You never will be." Under the old pattern, that voice gets accepted as fact. The person spirals into a familiar, exhausting story about their own inadequacy, one they've told themselves in different forms since childhood. Now picture the same moment, approached with the tools we've discussed. First, observation. There's that voice again, telling me I'm fundamentally not capable. Second, tracing its origin. This sounds a lot like the way my father used to talk about my effort not being enough, no matter what I did. Third, dialogue instead of suppression. What are you actually afraid of right now? That I'll be seen as a failure? That I'll be left behind while everyone else moves forward? And underneath that, maybe there's an honest, smaller fear. Not I am worthless, but I'm afraid I won't matter if I'm not achieving something. That's a completely different, far more workable problem than a sweeping verdict on the person's entire worth as a human being. Fourth, calling on another archetypal voice. Instead of only hearing the wounded inner child's panic, the person deliberately asks, what would the wisest, most grounded version of me say about this exact situation? Maybe that voice says something like, this is disappointing, and it's okay to feel that. It doesn't erase everything I've built so far, and it doesn't decide what happens next. I can ask for feedback, I can keep growing, and one decision by one manager on one particular day does not define my entire future. That is not denial. That is not forced positivity plastered over real disappointment. It's a fuller, more honest picture, built by consulting more than just the loudest, most wounded voice in the room. This is the entire shift Jung was pointing toward. Not eliminating the painful voice, but refusing to let it be the only voice you ever consult. There's one more practical tool worth mentioning here, something Jung himself relied on heavily during the most turbulent period of his own inner life. Writing things down in an ongoing, honest way, without editing yourself for how it looks. Jung filled what later became known as his Red Book, with the images, dialogues, and reflections that arose from his own inner exploration. You don't need to create anything nearly that elaborate. A simple notebook, or even notes on your phone, where you write down the harsh things your inner voice says, exactly as they appear, followed by a considered honest response, builds the exact same muscle over time. This is not about producing something polished. It's about creating a written record of the ongoing negotiation between the different parts of yourself, so that patterns become visible instead of invisible, and so that growth, which often feels invisible day to day, becomes something you can actually look back on and see clearly, months and years later. One final piece deserves mention here: self-compassion, correctly understood. This word gets used so often that it started to sound soft, almost meaningless, like a decoration rather than a discipline. But in Jung's framework, self-compassion isn't about pretending your flaws don't exist or telling yourself comforting lies. It's about extending to yourself the same basic respect you would extend to anyone else you were trying to genuinely understand, rather than simply judge. You wouldn't respond to a frightened child by screaming that they're worthless and will never amount to anything. You would try to understand what frightened them in the first place. Jung would ask you to offer that same basic decency to the frightened, wounded parts of your own psyche, not because they deserve to run the show unchecked, but because understanding, not cruelty, is what actually allows a person, or a part of a person, to grow and change. Let's talk about how to build this into an actual daily rhythm, because insight without practice fades within a few days, and Jung himself was insistent that psychological work is not a single breakthrough, but a sustained, ongoing discipline, closer to physical training than to a single moment of realization. Consider starting your day with a very short check-in, no more than a minute or two before you pick up your phone and let the outside world start dictating your inner state. Ask yourself simply, which voice is speaking right now? Notice whether you woke up already bracing for criticism, already rehearsing worst-case scenarios, already carrying yesterday's disappointment into a brand new day that hasn't done anything wrong yet. You're not trying to force yourself into artificial cheerfulness. You're simply gathering information, the same way Jung gathered information from his own dreams and inner images before deciding how to respond to them. Throughout the day, especially in moments of stress, criticism, or failure, use the same four-step process we outlined earlier. Notice the voice without immediately obeying it. Trace where it likely came from. Engage it in honest dialogue rather than suppressing or indulging it. And deliberately consult a wiser, calmer, more courageous part of yourself before accepting the first verdict your mind hands you. This doesn't need to take long. With practice, this entire sequence can happen in the space of a few seconds. A kind of internal check-in that becomes as natural as checking your surroundings before crossing a street. In the evening, consider a short written reflection, even just 3 or 4 sentences. What did the harsh voice say today, and in what situation did it show up? What did you learn about where that voice might have originally come from? And what would the wiser part of you want to say about today, looking back on it with a bit of distance and perspective? Over weeks and months, this simple habit builds exactly the kind of self-knowledge Jung considered essential to individuation. Not abstract, philosophical self-knowledge, but grounded, specific, personal understanding of your own recurring patterns, triggers, and inherited voices. You will not do this perfectly. Some days the old critical voice will take over completely, and you won't catch it until hours later, if at all. That is not failure. That is simply the reality of undoing patterns that in many cases are decades old. Jung himself, despite spending his entire career studying the unconscious mind, never claimed to have achieved some final permanent state of perfect self-mastery. Individuation was for him a lifelong process, but not a certificate you earn and then set aside. The goal was never a mind free of difficulty. The goal was a mind in honest, ongoing relationship with itself, capable of meeting difficulty with awareness instead of being blindly ruled by it. It's also worth saying plainly that this work is not purely solitary, even though most of what we've discussed today happens inside your own mind. Jung placed enormous value on relationships, on being truly seen and known by another person, precisely because other people often reflect back to us patterns we cannot see on our own. A close friend, a therapist, a partner who is willing to be honest with you, can often notice the voice you're using on yourself long before you notice it yourself. If you find that this work feels too heavy to carry entirely alone, reaching out for support, whether from people who care about you or from a trained professional, is not a departure from this process. It is very much a part of it. Jung's own most serious inner work happened during a period when he sought support and remained in dialogue with trusted colleagues, even as he explored the most difficult and disorienting material his own unconscious produced. There is a quiet kind of courage required for all of this, the courage to stop assuming your first thought about yourself is automatically correct, the courage to ask uncomfortable questions about where your harshest beliefs actually came from, and the courage to keep showing up for this practice on the days when it feels pointless, slow, or entirely invisible. But this is precisely the work that separates a life spent being unconsciously ruled by old wounds and borrowed voices from a life spent as an active, aware participant in your own becoming. Jung did not offer a shortcut. He offered something more valuable, a map, drawn from a lifetime of careful attention to the depths of the human mind, showing that the territory inside you, however dark or disorganized it might feel right now, is not random. It has structure, it has meaning, and it can, with patience and honesty, be understood and gradually transformed. If you take nothing else away from this video, Take this, the voice in your head that has been narrating your entire existence, judging your worth, predicting your failures, and defining your limits, was built. It was built out of childhood experiences, cultural messages, wounds, and moments where you were too young to defend yourself against the words that were used on you or around you. And anything that was built can be rebuilt, not through force, not through pretending the difficult parts of you don't exist, but through the slow, patient, honest work of noticing, questioning, and eventually dialoguing with the many voices inside you until they stop working against each other and start working together toward the person you are actually capable of becoming. That is what Carl Jung meant by individuation. That is what real change in your self-talk actually requires. Not a single trick, not a single affirmation repeated in the mirror, but an ongoing relationship with your own mind, built with the same patience, curiosity, and honesty you would offer to anyone else you were trying to genuinely understand. If this video gave you a new way of thinking about the voice inside your own head, let me know in the comments which part of your inner dialogue you're going to start questioning first. Was it the harsh inner critic, the frightened inner child, or maybe a voice you're only now realizing has been running the show for years without your permission? Naming it, out loud or in writing, is often the very first step Jung would point to, the moment something unconscious finally becomes conscious enough to work with. And if you want to go even deeper into how the unconscious mind actually shapes the way you think, feel, and speak to yourself, make sure you're subscribed, because that is exactly what we explore here. One idea at a time. The voice in your head has had control of the microphone for long enough. It's time you learned how to sit down with it, listen carefully, and finally respond.